A very good morning, afternoon, or evening to all of you, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Bastian Gigerich. I'm the Director for Defense and Military Analysis at the IISS, and I'll be chairing this meeting today. It's my pleasure to welcome you all. We have three speakers here with us today. They are Anja Richter, the Director of the Untitled Foundation office in London, and our partner in this joint project that I will mention in a minute. Fenella McGurty, who is the Senior Fellow for Defense Economics at the IISS, and she joined us about a year ago from Janes, where she spent over a decade working on defense economic issues. And last but certainly not least, Peter Round, who is a consulting senior fellow for European defense at the IISS, now retired Royal Air Force officer, and also active in new space. He chairs a new space company and has an interesting portfolio of activities, as you can see from his bio on the webpage. I will ask the three of them to speak for a couple of minutes each, following my introduction, and we will then have the opportunity to have Q&A and the ability for you to ask questions and make comments. There are two ways in which you can do that. You can use the Q&A window that is available at the bottom of your screen. You can type your question in there, and then I can look at that list and perhaps group things a little bit, find the themes, and ask our speakers to address those questions. You can also raise your hand electronically if you wish to ask a question on camera. Be advised that we will turn your camera on if we well, obviously you're still in control of your own machine, but we will put you on video. Let me put it that way. And when we ask you to make your intervention that way. So that are the ways that you can use to get into the conversation. We'll close promptly 60 minutes in or so. So let me say a little word of introduction about this webinar, the geoeconomics and geopolitics of COVID implications for European security. Of course, now the pandemic is, the coronavirus pandemic is in its second year. I think it is pretty clear that it presents a civil emergency and the public health crisis for most members of the Euro-Atlantic community and for the world at large. It is also pretty obvious that the coronavirus pandemic will be responsible for deep and long-lasting political and economic effects. And some of those may influence international order and stability, and more generally, the ability of governments to confront security challenges today and in the future. And many governments will, of course, emerge from this pandemic laden with debt and a severely depressed outlook for economic growth. And it's conceivable that among the effects of the pandemic, the second and third order effects is a rebalancing of power away from members of the Euro-Atlantic communities, the Euro-Atlantic community, and that all of that might have an effect on the shape of international order. And of course, the pandemic might itself be a driver of instability, insecurity, and the ability of governments to deliver the stabilizing measures and crisis management capacity that they would normally make available. It is, of course, we're still in this, but we felt it was now possible to attempt a first assessment of the geo-economic and geopolitical implications of the pandemic, and in terms of what is new, what is really just perhaps an intensification, an acceleration of what was there before. What might be the opportunities that exist as well, alongside the many challenges, and what might all of this mean for the ability of multinational institutions to contribute to problem solving in that age of COVID-19, or in the new age that we are about to enter. And to help us in this thought process that led to the paper, the Untitled Foundation and the ISS last fall, between September and December, actually convened a number, 6 to be precise, of web-based discussion meetings, which brought together groups of international experts and officials to discuss 3 strands of debate, really: the economics, international order questions, and security and defense questions. And this webinar marks the launch of a paper that the ISS has written that draws on these conversations and is informed by them. I should explicitly say that the paper is not a summary of these conversations that we had at the end of last year, but it served, these conversations served as the shall we say, intellectual frame for what we then put on paper. The paper will be available, either it just has become available or will be available within the hour on our webpage for download. So with those remarks out of the way, I'd like to now invite our speakers to lead us through some of the ideas and thoughts in the paper. We will go in the following order. I will first ask Fenella to speak about the economic picture. I will then turn to Pete to speak about the security and defense aspects, and I will then turn to Anya to speak a little bit about the political context, which obviously continues to evolve, and what that might mean for these themes as that we are exploring. So I will hand over to Fenella now.
Thanks very much, Bastian. So thanks everyone for having us today, and for being here for us to present this report. So I'm now going to take us through some of the economic trends that emerged as we went through this process. So if I just share some slides with you now to show you, to paint the economic picture, as it were, and the economic costs. I think beyond that immediate devastating human cost of the pandemic, the economic consequences were, and they will continue to be, severe. Global economic output is estimated to have shrunk by 3.5% in 2020. This is based on IMF data. And we've a recovery of 5.5% projected for next year. So given that advanced economies will be the most severely affected, these economies are going to take the longest period to recover, as the pandemic has exacerbated chronic demand deficiency that was identified in various sessions that we had. And that was already inhibiting growth in these countries kind of before the pandemic. The uniqueness of the crisis is also notable. It's created a sort of true global recession. All regions were affected, which had the effect of limiting external demand at a time when domestic markets were struggling. So while all regions were affected, the severity of the downturn, the paths of economic recovery diverged markedly for each region, and indeed within each region. So if you consider that China's economic output had recovered to pre-pandemic, so Q4 2019 levels by this time last year, the relative outperformance of Asia is actually masking some of the challenges faced by smaller markets within the region, so those particularly more reliant on energy or tourism, or less exposed to that domestic demand, that strong domestic demand in China. Equally, Europe struggled to control the virus in the early stages of the pandemic, now exacerbated by logistical issues with vaccine supply, and questions about sort of take-up and things like that has meant that we've had reimposition of protracted lockdowns throughout the region, and the fallout of those successive waves of infection, the economic shutdowns that have created further instability for growth in 2021, We had various revisions to economic data over the course of 2020, understandably so, and now it seems that those revisions are now starting to impact 2021 projections too. So the figures here compare the projections from the IMF back in January 2020 with the current or latest projection. But even over the last 5 months, we've seen the European economic outlook downgraded. So one percentage point for the growth for 2021 was reduced. Similarly, the UK's outlook was reduced for 2021 as well. So it's starting to impact 2021 outlook and impacting Europe more so than other countries. Other countries were actually upgraded. So if we now look at the individual country finances of the key players in Europe and compare those globally, there's been an estimated $14 trillion of fiscal countermeasures deployed globally, and 11 trillion of that was spent by advanced economies. That's sort of the Eurozone, G20. So consequently, the fiscal deficits among advanced economies have widened to around 13% of GDP on average last year. And it looks that they will persist at around 9 to 10% in 2021. Government debt equally is looking to exceed 122% of GDP, both last year and this year. So the euro area on the whole, while it's showing weaker economic performance, is actually on stronger footing fiscally than other advanced economies. Fiscal deficits are widening to a lower level, and it's obviously propped up by the stronger performing economy of Germany, which again masks perhaps the poorer finances of other countries in Europe. In terms of public debt, global public debt is projected to have reached 98% of GDP at the end of last year, up from a projection of 84%. So there's been this huge surge in global debt. The demographic composition of developing markets, that's reduced to the impact of the pandemic somewhat, and the cost of those measures needed to counter it. But the smaller deficits also point to the lack of fiscal headroom that these countries have to actually embark on these ambitious programs. So it's a bit of a balancing act between less of an impact of the pandemic, but also less of the financial tools with which to counter it. If we have the uneven distribution of the vaccine, will potentially further exacerbate the issue of inequality, undermine stability in certain regions. Stability may also be undermined if the price of oil and other commodities continues to remain at prices below the level needed to stabilize budgets and finances, creating a drain on productivity in these key markets and creating instability on the borders of Europe as well. So it's not just that there are issues with internal finances. The higher levels of inequality will persist even after the vaccine is distributed, because advanced economies will lack that fiscal headroom. There'll be this fiscal overhang, if you will, of these countries as they've spent all this money propping up the economy, and now it comes to sort of paying the bill, and countries may find that it's discretionary elements of spending, so international aid or even defence that could further exacerbate sort of these issues. My final slide is to just show how we tried to sort of distill all of these key themes, determine whether these developments were risks and or opportunities, but mainly whether they were new occurrences solely caused by the pandemic, or whether the pandemic has simply accelerated these themes. This looks slightly different in the paper. I've modified it for the slide, but this information is in the paper. If I just continue to just focus for a couple of minutes on the geo-economics aspects that we've already touched on, a lot of those new risks that have emerged. So distraction from sustainability, fiscal overhang impacting global development, but the longer term impacts of the severe disruption to education, to children's social development, and the potential impact on mental health. These are all longer term impacts that will take time to feed through into seeing how much impact they actually will have. There's also the longer term impacts of hysteresis or longer term persistent unemployment. We did have that movement towards digitalization and economic transformation before the pandemic. That's not something new, but the acceleration of it creates the new risk, because you're creating that gap between skills development and the actual demand for this kind of labor. So in the report, we go through and discuss most of these themes in detail, but the one I will quickly mention, so we've got the 4 T's, so transformation, green or digital, talent, tax and trade. That competition for talent will be a key theme that will emerge, increasingly central to the future of the global economy. So it's important to monitor which countries are attracting and developing the right personnel, and what sort of incentives states are creating in order to retain and attract talent. We talk a lot about trade and imbalances, and also the potential for tax wars to emerge. But my final point would just be to just touch on the surge in public debt and the long-standing dogma that public deficits should be limited to a low proportion of economic output. That was devised at a time when inflationary pressures were different, sort of back in the 1970s, but the shifts in economic foundations lead to the argument that we should have a fundamental rethink of what stable finances actually are. Higher public debt levels are more sustainable. Debt's quite cheap right now. So if countries do return to that policy of fiscal conservatism, of austerity too fast, then that risks destabilizing the economic recoveries in their nascent stages. And again, presents concerns for wider discretionary spending, defense and foreign aid. So that's a very quick journey through our findings on the geo-economics side. So if I just now pass to my colleague Peter Round to take us through the other aspects of the report. Peter.
Thank you very much, and hello to everybody. I'll use a time-neutral greeting, as I know you're all over the world, but thank you for spending a bit of time with us today. I'm sure some of the things I say on the defence and security field will cause debate. It always does. There's no right way of doing it. And of course, it's a big day in defence and security in the UK today, with the review coming out when the Prime Minister stands up in Parliament in a few hours' time. So it will be possible to mark some of our homework quite quickly. Anyway, moving on, the economic effect of the pandemic and any large economic shock always strikes alarm. I did have the word fear in at one point, but I struck that out and put alarm in into the defence community. Why is that? Well, of course, it's money. It's money or lack of it coming in the direction of defence. Defence sees that it still has the same task to do, but may have less resource to do it with. There's also the diversion of focus away from defence issues and away from the things that defence sees so clearly in its particular microcosm, but may be disguised by other activities. And I think Fenella covered some of those already, that some of the great crises disappear under the greater problem. But of course, the general view of defence is the threats are the same. And as we've watched the world, certain things have changed, but in many ways, nothing has. Key was that reaction to the pandemic at national level, and I talk around the world, tended to be exactly that, a reaction at national level, very much an inward-looking focus on what was going on, and that lack and loss of a view on the wider world. So when that starts to happen, will it change? Will it affect the way power is balanced? We've been in a very relatively comfortable position with the Euro-Atlantic community, managing that power balance as best it can. But with this change, do we see a threat of the ability of NATO and the EU to defend and protect a rules-based society as the rules change and change quite quickly? Nevertheless, having opened up quite pessimistically, I think from a defence perspective, we have observed from the outside a bit of a winner in that government and commercial entities have had to react very quickly and remember how to react very quickly to react to a crisis. So some of the issues that have been warned about for years in the futures projects done by NATO, by national organisations, by others, first is one of them, particularly the pandemic, has come true. And second is it's forced a need to be prepared to react and to see if you can react or not. But has the pandemic just accelerated what was happening anyway? That shift of power of away from Europe, the US looking in different directions, the thought of why the real problem is that in Asia and China. Has this just produced the effect that we were drifting towards already? And perhaps that's a good thing, that it has accelerated things. Nevertheless, we saw at the beginning of the crisis, the UN Secretary General have two attempts to use his position to call for a global ceasefire. A great idea, a global ceasefire in the middle of a crisis. Well, it wouldn't surprise me if quite a large number of people outside listening today had never even heard that the UN Secretary General had called for a global ceasefire. In fact, he did it twice, and it was systematically ignored by everybody. Now, I think that's a message in itself. Perhaps people weren't interested in the SecGen. I don't believe that for a moment. What I do believe is that the issues of the security and defence problems around the world just simply weren't important enough to make it onto the radar at the time. So is it just business as usual? Well, resources we know are strained, very strained in fact. The 2% rule with NATO remains. Everyone looked with interest for a new administration coming in from the US. Well, it's here, but is that going to make any difference to the 2% call? No, I'm sure the burden sharing will remain the same. Perhaps a silver lining, of course, is if you're trying to make 2% of a smaller GDP, then it's a smaller number in the first place, and therefore it's easier to get to. But is it easier to get to with less money? We think not. So what has actually happened during the period? Well, Germany broke cover first, and its planned increase plus a bit more went through the parliament fairly easily. That was good news. A bit of reassurance for defence, perhaps a bit of reassurance for defence around the world that at least one nation was already thinking in a way to keep defence at the top of the radar. Or was it? Was it just inertia? And what will happen next? What will come up? The UK then came out with the 16.5 billion uplift in its defence spending. Hooray, we heard lots of people cry. Others, of course, just said, well, that will fill the hole that already existed. So we might learn a bit more about that from the Defence and Security Review today, and I'm not going to try and chase that one. One of the things we must be aware of, and is really important to hoist aboard, is that in the 2007-2008 economic crisis, we can now look back and see how defence spending was balanced against that crisis, and we know that defence spending lagged by up to 5 years. So the fact is, now we should be worried. In the future, perhaps we should be very worried. And with that 2% of GDP, meaning less money in the whole overall, we must think very carefully about spending in real money terms as opposed to just percentages. But even when that money is spent, where will nations spend it? Will they spend it in NATO or other international organisations through the EU? Will they spend it bilaterally? Will they spend it with local alliances? Or will they spend it at home? In other words, protecting their own home plate, which is really important. And defence capabilities, of course, are all about capability. Defence capabilities are about capabilities. That's what it's all about. But to the politician, of course, they're worth a lot more. It's about economics. And can, therefore, the international organisations continue to drive joint activity? Or will it just become a build it here at home for us? Turning to training and readiness. In the early stages, training stopped. How do we cope with this? Send the soldiers home. And I can speak from practical things that happened in my family of soldiers being sent home and told to wait for a long time. Of course, that then changed. There was the immediate or the early indications that we need to get back into business. The country still needs defending. But perhaps in many, many countries of the world, the need for those soldiers and military personnel to support the reaction to the pandemic. But of course, that removed them from their primary aim. So readiness had to go down and level of training had to go down at the same time. But how the recovery came from that is perhaps one of the silver linings, the more use of synthetic training and being forced into an area which in many parts of the military has been resistance to in the past. But only time will tell whether that will survive. But synthetic training for now has been a little bit of a saviour. So what of the future? How do international organisations stay relevant? The pandemic has shown us that geographic boundaries are pretty irrelevant. Does that mean geographic-based alliances are irrelevant as well? If not, They must find a way to articulate how they can be relevant as new tensions play out, how we find methods of paying for it, and how we cope with the below threshold activity. I've not mentioned the word hybrid yet. We've done quite well at just coming up to 7 minutes, but hybrid warfare and the way of activity acting below threshold is something we still need to deal with. It's still there, and in some ways has taken greater preference. So this could be the opportunity to bring in new capabilities, those capabilities that do not end up with a shiny new tank, aircraft or ship at the end of them, but still need to be pushed through the decision makers, to be funded, and to find their way to defend us in the new world order. The key here, though, I think, is that the risks haven't changed, the defence issues haven't changed, that the people have changed, the world has changed, and defence must find a way to change with it. NATO, for instance, must articulate why it exists as a global activity. What role does defence have in the hybrid era? A question that's been asked before and is being asked now. And one final thought, and we may learn more from the British reaction today, is which direction should we look if the US is turning to the East? Does supporting the US in the East lead to more support for those of us who are sitting here in Europe? And I don't want to be too parochial on that. But I think I'll stop there. The key bit and the key message is nothing really has changed, but everything has changed. And with that, I'll pass on to Angela.
Well, thank you very much, Pete, and of course, Fenella, for your remarks. And I would like to commend all of you for turning our very wide-ranging discussions that sometimes got a bit off track into such a well-organized report, which I've already had the privilege of reading. So on behalf of the Hans Eidler Foundation, let me also just welcome everyone else to today's event. As Bastian said, I run the Hans Eidler Foundation's London office. And for those who've never heard of us before, we are a German political foundation based in Munich with offices around the world. So I'm just going to pick up some of the points already made and add some of my observations or comments I took away from our discussions, focusing more on the political dimension. And the main theme I took away from our round of discussions was that the pandemic has only accelerated existing trends and caused few, if any, shifts by itself, as the matrix Fenella showed earlier. I'd pick out on Pete's point of international organizations, the impression that they and alliances in a broader way have failed or stood up to the test. We've been talking about the decline of multilateral institutions for years. So the pandemic again just reinforced this with few positive examples countering this narrative. However, it seems it has not killed the call for stronger cooperation entirely. The United States returned to the Paris Agreement and the WHO, the COVAX alliance and plans for a D10 of G7 countries plus India, Australia and South Korea show that there is still an appetite for alliances. And the EU presents a curious case of itself, having had ups and downs during the pandemic, and surveys a majority of Europeans called for more European integration, whether it was business leaders who worried about supply chains and border closures and the single market, or voters asking for more cooperation on health matters, although this view might have changed following the vaccine fiasco. And talking about vaccines, the uneven distribution of vaccines Fenella has mentioned, that exacerbates inequality in emerging markets. Again, the pandemic just makes a bad situation seemingly worse. I would add the problem of corruption, especially in countries where it is endemic and there's a lack of good governance. We have examples of dodgy government deals and the procurement of PPE in our own countries, and we currently see the political fallout in Germany. But around the world, the vaccine rollout is overshadowed by cronyism, allowing the well-connected elite or certain politically favored groups to get the jabs first. The distribution does not only exacerbate inequality between advanced and emerging markets, but in many cases within the country itself, fueling social unrest and threatening stability. In a country like Lebanon, that is already on its knees, instability affects the whole region, of course. And Pete said the world remains a risky place. Well, nothing has changed, everything has changed. From a security and defense perspective, not much has changed. But many of those who would normally contribute to stability are somewhat weaker and a lot poorer. I would also add that the longer the pandemic lasts, they are simply distracted and too focused on domestic issues that they don't have the bandwidth to engage in mediating in global conflicts or go beyond just calling out aggressive behavior. China is not the only country that has exploited the pandemic to get away with aggressive behavior, whether at the Indian border or in Hong Kong. And even though this is not directly related to European security, I wonder if the international community would react to the violence, for example, in Myanmar differently if there was not a pandemic going on. So a international order begins at home is another key word or slogan of the report, and goes back to what I said on the focus on domestic issues. Some of the more seemingly off-topic discussions during our sessions concern what I would lump together as socio-economic shifts and the threat to social cohesion. We mused about the impact of city dwellers moving to rural areas with huge tax implications in the US, or dead inner cities and high streets, or the increasing number of digital nomads. If you can work from anywhere, why move to an expensive city like London or San Francisco, which links to the talent and tax wars Fenella has mentioned. But how do societal changes relate to security? New social rifts cause social unrest. And when we're talking about European security, we may primarily think of external threats, but look at the United States, where home security and the threat from within has become a top priority. And there are similar concerns in Germany, where extremists are mingling with anti-COVID protesters, and the so-called left behind have become more radicalized during the pandemic, resulting in skirmishes with the police and security forces. Combined with the rising inequality between people who amass savings and those hard done by, and the economic consequences of the pandemic, we're only going to see once support schemes end and more people lose their jobs. We may face, if not a summer, a winter of discontent. So the security threat from within is increasing. It has been said that in contrast to authoritarian regimes like China, which are constantly under pressure to deliver and must fear that their legitimacy will be undermined, Western democracies have elections as shock absorbers. And as the report notes, over the course of the pandemic, citizens could clearly see or tell the difference between good and bad governance and vote their leaders out if they fell short, something President Trump experienced. So Western governments have a legitimacy advantage, but they don't seem to have used it wisely, and in many cases squandered it. If we must convince our own citizens that democracy is the best form of government, how can we appeal to other countries? Which leads me to my last point on the West not being a good narrator. One argument that stood out for me was that the West, or liberal democracies, were not very good at making a strong case for the Western model of good governance, which includes the transparency of failures, whether to their own citizens or to a global audience. While China's global credibility may have received a blow, I think we all agreed that it had been much better at shaping the narrative, aggressively pushing its success message, delivering masks, etc. And we see a similar pattern now and there, or even Russian vaccine diplomacy. Meanwhile, Europe and its transatlantic partners seem to be constantly on the back foot, squabbling among themselves, and the current UK-EU vaccine wars are just the worst example. And social cohesion is faltering. General Sir Patrick Saunders, head of Strategic Command, said this weekend that China has pursued a strategy of winning without fighting, changing the terms of the international order. He was, of course, talking about military information age technology and the battle for cyberspace. But I think while he lamented the West had lost the strategic initiative, you could also argue we have lost the narrative. It might not just be the Chinese economic strength following their quicker recovery and their military spending, but their more convincing narrative. The report notes the key is not to let China's message become the norm. We need to get better at telling our success story and the advantages of liberal democracies that protect its citizens and save lives rather than detaining its doctors. The big problem, of course, is that it is difficult to criticize restrictions of freedoms and civil liberties in other countries if we don't seem to treat our own citizens any better. Excessive police forces used at protests as a very current example in the UK. And needless to say, the storming of the Capitol did not help our narrative. The point in the report has also been made that the narrative argument on security and defense needs to change. The narrative needs to be told in a new way. And we've discussed in many sessions that politicians are not good at explaining to their voters why they need to spend money on defense. And this will be harder after the pandemic as money gets tighter and people will expect more investment in health and social care. So the narrative should not focus just on spending, but what it is for, or rather against, and what purpose new capabilities will have. As Pete mentioned, the integrated review will at least be an opportunity for the UK government to do just that. But the report also knows that NATO must learn to sell its story. So we need to just be better storytellers, but story sellers. And as a last note on geopolitics, someone in our session said that we are still in the transition from the unipolar moment to a new world order, where the rules of the game are still emerging. And whether it is warfare or war crimes, including biochemical attacks or unfair competition, intellectual property rights, or global health standards when it comes to vaccines, nothing seems to be set in stone anymore. There is hardly any punishment for misbehavior. So while the pandemic may not change the international order, it might be helping to shape those new rules of the great power game we are facing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the three of you for leading us through some of the themes in the paper, which is available on the webpage. If you go to the ISS webpage, to the research paper section, you can download the full paper there. And then also Anja for weaving in some of the themes of our discussions that we had at the end of last year, and so to speak, fill in some of the other points that may relate to the paper, but perhaps weren't as prominent in there. I think that gives us lots to discuss. I think it is quite notable that there is that sense of that there's a parallel a reality here where some things change quite dramatically and quite quickly, but a lot actually hasn't. And breaking that down across areas of activity, economics, defense, and the delays that might still affect defense at a later stage, I think is an important point. I liked Anja's point about the importance of storytelling in the sense of making your case and making it well to a diverse set of audiences. And I think in the paper there's this line that international order begins at home, that in a way I think Anja in particular kind of used, at least in spirit, for her remarks, that I think is also quite important. And so because of that parallel reality, we see rapid adaptation in some areas, but also, and I think Pete brought that out quite clearly, business as usual in also some other areas. And those things coexist right now, searching perhaps for a new equilibrium in future. So let us turn to questions and contributions from the group. I will pick up some that are in the question and answer chat function here that the speakers have available, and then also call on one or two people who have raised their electronic hand. I will perhaps take two questions first, and group them together, and then turn to people who have raised their hands. So I will turn to two from the chat function. So one is about what one might term the comprehensive approach, or in other words, how are people acting across the civil-military gap, and has the pandemic actually led, or has the pandemic contributed to a better working mechanisms there, to better connecting the internal and external security challenges and channels in terms of institutions and in terms of capacity. I suppose resilience is one of those buzzwords that is always out there. Somebody else on the chat asked, given that a pandemic had already been identified as a major threat prior to COVID, so in other words, it wasn't entirely unexpected. What do institutions and actors need to do to be better prepared in future? So how does one make all of these different instruments work together better as a result of this? I mean, I suppose in the defense realm, there's that specific question of, given that all the old threats are still there, but now this one has really hit home, and perhaps defense actors are now asked to underline their value and their contribution in new ways. I wonder whether speakers might want to pick up on that notion of resilience and how a whole of society responds to these kinds of challenges is emerging, or what indeed would need to happen for it to emerge and to be better prepared in the future. So maybe let's start with that. Who wants to start on this? Pete, I see you nodding. Why don't you start, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, thanks very much, Bastian. And two questions, good questions. Thank you. So I'll try not to ramble, but to try and focus a little bit on them. So I think this issue of this shouldn't have been a surprise, I think, is really important. Lots of futures work, I think was the phrase I used, but looking forward, predicting the future is always very difficult. But lots of work has been done, and there are some themes across those different pieces of work which come out, which is, crises around water shortages, food shortages, and pandemic. And pandemic is always there. If there is one thing the our pandemic has done, is to show that sometimes that futures work is right. And I think one of the issues that all futures work has is, if you actually go back and review the futures work that was done maybe in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on, then you tend to find that the level of accuracy in the prediction was quite low, not because it was necessarily wrong, but because it predicts all the possible futures, and you can't plan for all of them. I think we have to be wary in the future of grabbing the last issue that occurred. It's the military are always accused of wanting to fight the last war, and I think we have to, on a bigger picture, think very carefully about whether we just suddenly swing to being fantastically prepared for coping with the pandemic, but less prepared for other things. It is the political balance, and our politicians will decide. But if there's anything that comes out good, I hope it's that the futures work that's been done in the past and new work emerging now is reviewed quite carefully and notice is taken of it. And that there is an acceptance. You have to spend money rather, and effort and resource on being prepared. Something that's very hard to sell at the political level. We're going to do this just in case, but there might not be a use for it. Is really, really tough. The other question was about communications and the issues of working cross-government, cross-organisation. I would say the pandemic, and I mentioned it in my piece, has certainly showed that geographic boundaries don't matter. I think the other thing it showed on the internal look is this affects everybody. and has caused elements of most governments to all work together. The military has worked with the health service. The government has had to worry about everybody. Soldiers are as badly affected by COVID-19 as nurses or factory workers or anybody else. So I think it has shown us that everybody's affected and everybody needs to work together. And it also has made the different sectors of society come together to work together. And one of the issues that has separated the military out in many countries historically is the fact they're not part of society. And I think because this has brought them into society, as well as other aspects of society that are less well seen, public health bodies and so on, I think we're all better equipped. We all know more about them, as a result of which I think they will work better together in the future. The key is to hang on to the lessons learned.
Thank you very much, Pete. Anya, Fenella, would you like to come in on this one as well? Anya?
Yeah, I just briefly like to come in and pick up on Pete's point on the military not being part of society. And we've had this discussion in Germany for years for obvious reasons and historical reasons. And the military, just like in the UK, many other countries, has been called on during the pandemic and helped out, whether it was with logistics or track and tracing, and have been widely deployed. So this could have been a chance to publicly improve those civil-military relations in the public eye. However, I think it has been a missed opportunity because I don't see how this has changed. But of course, we're in an election year, and this is not something you win votes with. And so going back also to the question of defense spending, what is defense for? This will not feature at all in the German debate this year, I think. So I think there was an opportunity that has been missed, but of course overshadowed by political and electoral thinking.
If I could just jump in on the spending point, something that we've seen over the last year, as I've pulled together defense spending data, is this distortion that's been caused by the increasingly sort of security-focused roles that defense has taken on, and that's kind of artificially boosted defense expenditure. So we're now running the risk of where you blur that line and you bring those elements all in together, you then lose some transparency in spending and potentially do not prioritize the roles that were there before and the capabilities that were needed as well. So I think in terms of transparency, one of perhaps a lesson that could be learned is in Scandinavia, there is a separate funding line that is within defense, but it's for sort of crisis management operations. So there is that clear delineation between of responsibilities and where that funding is going. And I think that that's something that needs to be important. If we are going to prioritize these roles within defense, that clear funding, that clear path, it is vital. Otherwise, you lose transparency, and that's always a bad thing, certainly in my job. In terms of defense expenditure. So yeah, that would be my only point really in terms of resilience, just in maintaining that transparency and making sure that if you are going through these new roles that you're funding them adequately.
Thank you very much. I think, of course, a number of nations have already begun to redefine their concepts along those lines and are moving through that. It is fair to say, Pete, I think when you said the military is not part of society, that might have sounded a bit harsh. I think.
Yes, I apologise. What I meant was that they can be seen as separate, and sometimes are not as transparent in what they're doing. Is that right?
Yeah, and perhaps, and I think that cuts both ways, because there also are fewer touch points now for other elements in society with the armed forces, simply because, at least in Europe, a lot of them are smaller than they used to be. Are less, and I don't mean this in a purely military term, dispersed than they used to be, so less visible in the lives of many citizens and in the lives of many politicians, which is, of course, one of the points that Pete made earlier. Thank you for that. There are a number of additional questions that are coming in. And I want to turn next to some people who have raised their blue hand, but I want to pick up one other partial question first that was in the chat as well, asked by Christoph Meyer, who was also one of the people who asked one of the other questions, but he raised an additional point about the implications of the rise of digital surveillance methods as a result of COVID, and we picked this up very briefly in the paper. I should probably declare that I'm a co-author of the paper, so I'm allowed to occasionally say something other than just moderate the session. But I think the point we made in the paper is we located this aspect into what we call systemic competition between democracies and autocracies in that context, in that international order context, so to speak. And the worry that was discussed in our sessions, but also is reflected in the paper, is really that measures of social control via surveillance techniques might emerge as or might be perceived as suitable and effective ways to control the virus, and if you marry that to the practice where ways of democratic practice and democratic participation are being curbed as a result of emergency measures, and that quite understandable measure to centralize power in times of emergencies, then that together to us seemed to be a risky mix and something that might be very hard to contain, and something that might develop a bit of a pull, which would be to a degree worrying. So I want to call on two people who raised their hand, and I'd like to ask Ramin Forghani, please, to ask his question or make his comment. Your mic is on.
Yes, thank you. The question is regarding the space domain, and perhaps suits best with Peter Round. We had seen considerable increase in global reliance on the space sectors and space assets prior to the COVID situation, and in course of the COVID situation, we have had increase on demand of telecommunications, for instance. I'm wondering about the impact of the pandemic on the space sector in Europe. Consider different geopolitical and geoeconomic contexts across the continent. For instance, here in Luxembourg, we had limited restrictions in course of the COVID, the considerable space industry and companies in the country. So how has it impacted the industry across Europe, and how do you see the situation after the restrictions? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. I'll get another one in before we turn to answering that, and I suppose Pete, that is primarily for you. But others might want to weigh in. Adrian Cowderoy has also raised his hand. Adrian, if yes, your mic is live now.
Thanks. Fenella made an interesting point. It's when she had a table of risks and opportunities. It's in the opportunities, there's deteriorating US-China relationships. There's also systemic competition, that the autocracy versus democracy thing. How does that work as an opportunity at a political level, at an economic level, at a defense level?
Okay, Adrian, thank you very much. So my short answer is going to be it's in the eye of the beholder, but we might want to say a few words about that a challenge versus opportunity dynamic. But first, let's turn to that question on the impact of the pandemic on a particular sector of activity. Pete, do you want to start on that? And then I'm going to turn to Anja and Fenella to see whether they want to add anything on that. Luxembourg is obviously a place you know quite well, Pete, and the space sector is a place you know quite well. So take it away.
Yes, and I won't go on very long. I think the space sector is changing very rapidly, particularly with with more new space, with cheaper launch, with more launch around, and with more space capability being in the hands of civilian and, more importantly, commercial actors. And all I'll say is this, that there was some slowing down as a result of the pandemic, mainly because of physical issues at the surface, in other words, launches and people loading satellites and doing the practical aspects to do the launching. But in terms of the interrelationship in the space industry, you would hope that the space industry is a pretty advanced industry and takes on and uses and utilizes new technologies, the sort of thing we're using today. And I think that has been true. So I think we all know our dependence on space. There's no doubt that our dependence on methods of communication, which include space, has become even more important. And I think the effect of that has been to drive a very positive vector in terms of investment in civilian space and support for the concepts of what the non-military aspects of space are doing. So actually, I don't think it's been too much of an inhibitor, but I do think it has affected the rate of change, mainly because of the limitations on launch. I'll leave it at that.
Pete, thanks. That leaves us next with that question of what is an opportunity and what is a risk. If you had a look at the paper already, or if you recall the slide that Fenella showed you, there were a couple of things that are both an opportunity and or a risk. Fenella, do you want to, I have a few comments I wanted to make, but do you want to perhaps say a few words? One of them is divergent recoveries, for example. Perhaps say a few words about how you think about that, or also green recovery is another one, and then I can pick up some of the other ones. But do you want to say a few words about that? Yeah.
Sure. So it's the balance between them and the gaps created that create those opportunities as these themes sort of develop and emerge. So specifically, about divergent recoveries, some regions will do better, and that creates opportunities within those countries to therefore fill the gaps of regions perhaps not doing so well. The impact on financial services, both a risk and opportunity, with the extension of increased demand for debt, was to the benefit of certain investment or institutions, banks and things like that, and they've behaved actually quite accommodatively throughout the process, so that creates the opportunity of that increased demand and being there to be able to supply it. The risk is when the potential defaults will come through as the fiscal stimulus measures come to an end, and these defaults may come through, and that increases the risk for these institutions. I think of the sort of specific risks, so there's the US-China relations. I think if the opportunity there is, again, in my view, the gaps created, or the opportunities for those countries sort of regionally. If you look at the recent trade relations between Japan and Vietnam, Japan trying to de-shore their supply chain meant that they were looking to relocate some production to other actors within the region, be it Vietnam. So that's the opportunity it's creating. It's as you pull back from some countries, it creates opportunities for others. But I'll pass to Bastian to sort of embellish a bit more on the relations side.
Yeah, thanks. And I think, one of the points we heard in our discussion meetings last year, and that we wanted to pick up in the paper, is of course also that there is this tendency, certainly we felt amongst the governments of EU and NATO member states, to really, and for understandable reasons, choose a set of defensive measures almost designed to protect and preserve what was there. And the point we wanted to make is that one can think about some of these challenges differently, and one can think about a more proactive agenda on cooperation and coordination. and that in itself is quite an important point, which means that the opportunities might be a bit harder to find, but they seem to us to be there. And I think the process of European integration, I think Anja alluded to it in her remarks, might be an example of that, where Europe might end up, I mean, right now it doesn't look like it would, but it might end up acting strategically in areas that it, before the pandemic, perhaps did not prioritize as much, which can be the nucleus of multilateral moments around green transformation, around other areas that were just not perhaps receiving that push before the pandemic. So it is about these two sides of that coin, which we wanted to acknowledge, because it seems to us, first of all, a reality that when there is a risk to some, there's likely to be an opportunity for others, and the other point is that even in the context of great risk, one can think about positive moments for cooperation amongst like-minded states. So that's what we wanted to capture there. We're 2 minutes over time. I'm going to make I'm afraid I have to apologize to one or two people who I wasn't able to call upon. There are interesting questions around which we didn't get to, around debt breakdown, as Nicholas McLean raised the issue that of course the increase in debt is important in the context of the pandemic, but one also would need to look at the way in which that debt is structured, and that's certainly a follow-on conversation that one can have at some point. And Nicholas also raised the question, actually, whether the pandemic and the effects that or the damage caused by COVID perhaps might make some actors think a little bit harder about future biological attacks, or at the same time might make some actors think a little bit harder about, in defense terms, CBRN, defense and consequence management, which again would be a good theme for that civil-military conversation that some of you have raised. So there's lots to continue the conversation. For now, I'd like to thank you. And again, apologies that I wasn't able to call on everybody. There are a few other things that I didn't get to. Time is short, as always. I hope you take the opportunity to download the paper, read the paper. We will post a recording of this session within the next 24 hours or so. So that's available to you as well. And with that, I'd like to thank again Fenella, Pete, and Anja for their excellent contributions to our discussion. I'd like to thank you in our audience who contributed to the debate, and everybody for their time. I hope you have a good rest of the day wherever you are. And I will see you soon at an ISS webinar, and eventually we will be able to meet in person again. I point that out as an opportunity that will be with us, hopefully, before too long. So thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day. Bye for now.